welcome to today's deep dive. Today we are unpacking a single, really profoundly challenging document.
Yeah, it's a heavy one for sure.
It really is. It's
Yeah.
authored by pastoral clinical counselor Friar John Baptist, and the piece is titled "No One Cares: A Spiritual Symptom of Stress."
Right, and what's fascinating here is that the author actually pulls from two very distinct fields of study for this.
Yeah, he blends the modern healthcare analysis of Leanne Thyman with the foundational existential psychiatry of Viktor Frankl.
Which is such a unique combination. Yeah.
Exactly. And the mission for our conversation today is to take a very specific, incredibly heavy feeling that so many of you have probably experienced. I mean, that raw feeling that just no one cares.
And we're going to completely reframe it.
Yes. We are moving away from treating this as like a simple indicator that you just need a long weekend. Instead, we're examining it as a fundamental crisis of meaning.
Specifically tailored to those who spend their lives caring for others.
Right. So to kind of grasp the psychological weight of the framework we're looking at today, I want you to picture running a marathon.
Okay, a marathon.
Yeah, so you've put in the grueling hours of training, your muscles are burning, you've hit that proverbial wall, but you keep pushing because, well, you know the finish line is coming.
You're expecting the crowds, right?
Exactly. The cheering, the people handing out those little cups of water. But as you round the final corner, the route is completely empty.
Oh, wow.
There is absolutely no one cheering for you. The streets are barren. And worse, there isn't even a finish line.
You just have to keep running.
Yes, in total silence, completely alone. That suffocating silence, the sheer weight of putting in maximum effort for zero external validation, that is the exact psychological terrain we're exploring today.
That marathon analogy really captures the mechanics of this beautifully because, the crisis we're talking about isn't merely a lack of physical stamina to keep running.
Right, it's not just tired legs.
It's exactly. Friar John Baptist's document grounds this discussion in a concept introduced by healthcare expert Leanne Thyman. This is from her 2012 book, Self-Care for Healthcare.
And she really isolates that specific thought, right, the thought that no one cares.
Yes. Thyman isolates that thought, and she categorizes it notably not as a physical symptom of overwork, and not even as a standard mental symptom of, daily frustration.
She labels it as a spiritual symptom of stress.
Precisely. She defines this as a much deeper, more systemic wound. It's that crushing sensation that your continuous efforts, your personal sacrifices, and honestly, your very presence have just ceased to matter to the world around you.
Okay, so I want to push back on that terminology right away because I feel like when we throw the word spiritual into a discussion about, say, workplace or caregiver burnout, people immediately associate it with theology.
Right, they think of religious doctrine.
Exactly. And if we're looking at this through the lens of psychology and healthcare, classifying stress as strictly spiritual seems like kind of a leap.
That's a totally fair point. But the text actually requires us to detach the word spiritual from any strictly denominational context.
Okay, so how is it strictly spiritual then?
Well, within this specific framework, the spiritual aspect refers to the core animating force of the human psyche. It is the very center of your personal agency and purpose.
Okay, I think I see where you're going.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
physical exhaustion is the body signaling, I cannot take another step. Emotional exhaustion is the heart signaling, I cannot process another tragedy.
But this spiritual symptom is something else entirely.
Exactly. The thought, no one cares, is essentially a protective mask for a terrifying existential question. When a caregiver hits this wall, what they're fundamentally asking is, does my life and my service have any meaning?
Okay, so it strikes at the absolute foundation of why they are choosing to endure the hardship in the first place.
Yes, exactly.
And if the root of the exhaustion is a loss of meaning, well then a nap or a vacation is fundamentally going to fail to treat the actual disease.
A nap doesn't fix an existential crisis.
It really doesn't, and the source material highlights a highly vulnerable population dealing with this specific meaning deficit. Caregivers.
Both professional and family caregivers, right?
Right, we're talking about professional caregivers like nurses, social workers, therapists, but heavily focusing on family members caring for sick relatives at home.
And the document outlines what it calls a toxic triad that these individuals face.
Yeah, let's break that down. First, there's the systemic neglect of their own well-being because their energy is entirely outwardly focused.
Right, they're not eating, not sleeping properly.
Exactly. Second, there is an almost total absence of appreciation. And third, There are continuously compounding responsibilities.
And the mechanics of that toxic triad are devastating when we look at how the human brain processes validation.
Biologically speaking.
Yes, biologically. I mean, humans are social creatures. We're wired for feedback loops. If you expend energy for the tribe acknowledges your contribution.
Which signals to your brain that you are a valuable, secure member of the group.
Exactly. But this triad disrupts that biological feedback loop entirely. The caregiver is outputting massive amounts of physical and emotional energy.
And neglecting their own baseline needs to do so.
Right, and they are receiving zero reciprocal input. They're doing more and more and hearing less and less.
So over time, the brain basically interprets this lack of feedback as a loss of existence.
Precisely. The caregiver begins to feel literally invisible.
It's like the difference between your phone battery being at 1%, which is, standard physical exhaustion, and your phone completely disconnecting from the cellular network entirely.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, you could technically have a fully charged battery, but if there's no signal, you are totally isolated from the ecosystem. You've lost connection to the network of meaning.
And that network connection is precisely what Viktor Frankl's work addresses, which is why Friar John Baptist anchors the second half of his document in Frankl's theories.
Right, Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust.
He was. And in his monumental 1946 work, Man's Search for Meaning, he presented a radical shift in how we understand human endurance.
Because his core psychological insight is that the search for meaning isn't some secondary luxury pursuit, right?
Exactly. It's not something we engage in only after we have enough food and sleep. The drive for meaning is the primary fundamental engine of human survival.
Here is where it gets really interesting, because the document focuses heavily on Frankl's observation of human endurance under extreme suffering.
Right.
The text points out that humans possess this astonishing capacity to endure horrific difficulty, but that endurance is entirely conditional.
Conditional on what?
Well, we can only survive immense suffering if we remain connected to a purpose, a person, or a value that is greater than ourselves. The suffering has to be contextualized.
Context really is the dividing line between endurance and despair. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Frankl argued that a person can survive almost any how of existence if they possess a firm why.
But the text also explores the dark inverse of that psychological equation, doesn't it?
It does. When the why becomes clouded, which is exactly what happens when that toxic triad strips a caregiver of all feedback and validation, the stress undergoes a chemical change.
It doesn't just remain as daily friction.
No, it curdles.
Yep.
It turns into profound emptiness and deep resentment.
So if I apply Frankl's logic here, Frankl isn't saying the suffering magically stops hurting. Are we saying caregivers suffering from the symptom are basically just lifting rocks in the dark?
Lifting rocks in the dark. I like that.
Because, think about it, the physical act of suffering hasn't changed. If you're training for the Olympics, your muscles scream, you're in agony, but the pain possesses a narrative.
You're building toward a goal. The pain makes sense.
Right. But if someone forces you to lift those exact same heavy rocks in a dark room for absolutely no reason, it isn't training anymore. It's just torture.
It breaks your mind.
Exactly. The resentment doesn't stem from the weight of the rocks. It stems from the absence of the narrative.
The resentment builds because the human mind aggressively rejects meaningless suffering. When the environment goes silent, when there's no thank you from a dementia patient who literally cannot remember who you are.
Or from a hospital system that just views you as a metric.
Exactly. When that happens, the noble act of caregiving feels like meaningless torture. Every late-night alarm, every skipped meal, every frantic drive to the pharmacy ceases to be a step toward a meaningful goal.
It simply becomes punishment.
The caregiver hasn't lost the physical strength to lift the rocks. They have lost the narrative reason to keep picking them up.
But this introduces a massive structural problem for the caregiver.
How so?
Well, we've established that meaning requires a feedback loop, a connection to a why. But how does a caregiver locate that why when their immediate physical environment is structurally incapable of providing it?
Right, that's the real challenge.
Like, if you are a mother caring for a child with severe violent behavioral issues, or a nurse working a 14-hour shift only to be screamed at by a patient's family, the room you are standing in cannot offer you validation.
It's impossible in that moment.
So where do you source care when human recognition is totally structurally absent?
That structural absence is the tension driving the final section of Friar John Baptist's document. When human systems of validation fail, How do we respond?
And the text presents a twofold framework for finding an anchor, right?
Yes. The first part of this response looks toward Christian scripture, specifically 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, which reads, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you."
Now, as we dive into this specific text, I just want to clarify for you, the listener, that our goal here is to impartially examine the mechanics of the source material.
Right, we're looking at psychological application here.
Exactly. We are looking at how this document utilizes theology to solve a psychological crisis without taking a stance on the theology itself. The author uses this verse as a specific tool for cognitive offloading.
And the psychological utility of the verse, as analyzed by Friar John Baptist, is quite specific. He emphasizes that this scripture does not deny or minimize the caregiver's physical or emotional burden.
It's not telling them to just cheer up.
No, not at all. The text doesn't suggest that the anxiety is an illusion. Instead, it offers a presence of care precisely when human recognition fails.
It's an invitation to stop carrying the burden alone.
Exactly. When the immediate room is silent and the human feedback loop is broken, this framework offers a non-human higher structural anchor. It provides an external location to offload the crushing anxiety of feeling unseen.
Okay, so that's the first part. And then the second part of the text response pivots back to Viktor Frankl and the concept of human agency.
Right. Frankl's philosophy firmly rejects the idea of passive victimization.
Even when external circumstances are entirely out of your control, which, let's be honest, is the daily reality for a family caregiver who cannot simply quit their role.
Even in those situations, Frankl insists that we retain the ultimate, untouchable human freedom, and that is the ability to choose our internal response to the suffering.
He observed that the last of the human freedoms is choosing one's attitude in any given set of circumstances.
And Friar John Baptist translates this philosophical concept into actionable responses for the caregiver. The document outlines 3 specific internal pivots.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, intentionally reconnecting with the original core values that inspired the service. Essentially, digging back through the burnout to find the initial why.
Okay, finding the roots again.
Second, actively seeking out relationships entirely outside of the caregiving dynamic, where the individual is genuinely seen, recognized, and valued for who they are, not just what they provide.
That makes a lot of sense. And the third?
Third, fundamentally uncoupling one's self-worth from the volume of praise received from the people being served.
Okay, so what does this all mean? I really want to push back on behalf of our listeners here.
Go for it.
Telling someone to choose their response sounds incredibly empowering in a philosophical text. But if I put myself in the shoes of a caregiver who is completely spiritually exhausted,
Who hasn't slept a full night in months?
right, and who feels utterly invisible to the world, telling me to actively seek out relationships and do the internal work of uncoupling my self-worth, doesn't that just feel like adding a massive chore to an already overflowing to-do list?
This raises an important question, because the danger of treating psychological reframing as a to-do list is the most common pitfall in modern self-care.
It feels like handing a drowning person a heavy textbook on how to swim.
Exactly. But it's a tension the author anticipates. Friar John Baptist and Viktor Frankl are not assigning homework.
Okay.
The thought, "no one cares," is not a prompt to increase your networking efforts or schedule more social outings. It is an alarm bell. And the fundamental function of an alarm bell is to mandate a complete stop.
Ah, the distinction between an alarm bell and a task is critical. You don't respond to a fire alarm by trying to clean the kitchen faster.
No, you stop what you are doing and exit the building.
Right.
The invitation presented in the text is to pause. The first step of treating this spiritual wound is not a physical action. It's not adding a new habit to your morning routine.
It's an internal realization.
A quiet, profound internal realization. Let's look at the biological friction of that third point, uncoupling self-worth from praise. As we discussed, we are pack animals wired to seek community approval to feel safe.
So when a caregiver receives no validation, their primal brain signals danger.
Exactly. Uncoupling your worth means utilizing your higher cognitive functions to override that primal panic. It is the internal realization that your intrinsic value as a human being exists entirely independently of the sick patient's ability to say thank you.
You don't have to perform more tasks to fix the spiritual exhaustion.
No, you have to shift your internal stance so the weight of the silence doesn't break your back.
You change the architecture of how you bear the weight. Wow. Let's kind of trace the full arc of the journey we've taken through these sources today, because the terrain is incredibly dense.
It really is.
We began by examining this heavy, isolating thought, no one cares. And through Leanne Thymon's framework, we learned to identify this not as a mere physical deficit requiring sleep, but as a profound spiritual wound.
A systemic crisis of meaninglessness and a loss of connection to the animating spirit of our work.
Right. And building on that diagnosis, we utilized Viktor Frankl's insights to map out our deep, non-negotiable psychological reliance on purpose.
We established that human endurance is astonishing, but it requires a narrative.
When the why disappears into the vacuum of an unappreciative environment, the resulting stress violently transforms into despair, making every act of caregiving feel like meaningless punishment.
And finally, we analyzed the source material's proposed methods for surviving that silence.
Whether examining the structural anchor offered by Christian scripture to offload cognitive anxiety, or Frankl's concept of activating human agency to choose our internal response, the objective remains the same.
The goal is to fundamentally rewire our feedback loops, finding ways to anchor our worth entirely outside of immediate human applause.
So for you listening, whether you are a full-time professional caregiver managing a ward of patients, a parent giving every ounce of your physical and emotional energy to your children, or simply someone feeling deeply invisible and unappreciated in your daily responsibilities, the core message of this document applies to you.
Your intrinsic value is not dictated by the applause of the people you serve.
The feeling that no one cares is a valid, terrifying alarm bell, and you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to acknowledge the heavy, suffocating silence of the room without letting it define your worth.
Ignoring that alarm bell only accelerates the spiritual exhaustion and deepens the wound. Healing really cannot begin until you acknowledge the absence of meaning and allow yourself to be held in care.
Even if that requires a radical internal rewiring of where you source that care from.
Absolutely.
We opened today's discussion by picturing that barren marathon, running with no finish line, surrounded by empty streets, waiting for a cheer from the crowd that is just never going to come.
It's an incredibly bleak image.
It is. But to close our analysis today, I want to leave you with a concept to chew on. Something that builds entirely on the tension we've unpacked from Frankl and Thyman today.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Viktor Frankl is correct, and the search for meaning is not a luxury, but our absolute deepest human survival drive, well, what happens when a caregiver's entire architecture of meaning becomes exclusively intertwined with the physical existence of the person they care for?
Oh, that's a tough question.
Right. If that person's condition deteriorates to the point where they can no longer show appreciation, or if they ultimately pass away, does the caregiver's reason for existing temporarily cease to exist as well?
The narrative just vanishes overnight.
And if so, how do you begin the impossible task of becoming the caregiver to your own lost sense of meaning? Wow. Keep searching for your why. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.